Modern Crime Scope uncovers shocking true crime stories, chilling mysteries, and real-life investigations that keep you on the edge of your seat. Sarah Whitman's calm exterior hid a chilling secret. When Officer Mark Reynolds pulled her over for a routine traffic stop, he had no idea he was about to uncover bodies hidden in her trunk, setting off one of the most shocking murder investigations the town had ever seen. The evening was calm. The sky painted in shades of deep orange and purple as the sun began to set over the quiet suburban highway. Most drivers were heading home from work or running last-minute errands, the hum of tires on asphalt blending with the distant sounds of city life. Among them was Officer Mark Reynolds, a veteran of the local police force, scanning the road with practiced eyes. He had been on duty for over 10 years and thought he had seen it all, but sometimes even the most ordinary nights could turn extraordinary in the blink of an eye. As he patrolled the stretch near the outskirts of town, his attention was drawn to a small sedan weaving slightly between lanes. The driver seemed nervous, glancing repeatedly toward the rearview mirror and checking her speed. Officer Reynolds flicked on his lights and followed at a safe distance. Pulling her car over was a routine procedure, but the unease in the driver's behavior immediately set him on alert. The driver, a woman who introduced herself as Sarah Whitman, appeared in her late 20s. At first glance, she seemed ordinary, almost too calm given the situation. Yet there was a tension in her movements. Her hands trembled slightly as she rolled down the window, and her eyes darted nervously toward the trunk of her car. Officer Reynolds approached cautiously, noting the faint but unusual smell wafting from the vehicle. It was subtle, something he couldn't immediately identify, but it added to the growing sense that this stop was not going to be routine. Reynolds asked for her license and registration, keeping his voice calm and professional. As he checked her information, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a pause, a hesitation in her answers that seemed rehearsed, like she was trying to maintain control over a situation spiraling out of her hands. Something in her demeanor triggered a protocol he had drilled into his mind over years of police work. Always trust your instincts, especially when the smallest detail feels wrong. After completing the initial check, Officer Reynolds asked if he could inspect the trunk. It was a standard request for someone acting unusually, and Sarah hesitated before reluctantly giving permission. The moment the trunk opened, a horrifying scene revealed itself. Underneath a pile of blankets lay two bodies, carefully concealed but unmistakable. Reynolds' heart raced, adrenaline surging as he realized the enormity of what he had just uncovered. This was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a crime scene, one that would shake the entire city. He quickly called for backup, alerting dispatch to the presence of human remains in the vehicle. The gravity of the situation set in as he secured the area, keeping Sarah calm but under control until other officers arrived. The ordinary evening had transformed into a nightmare, and the questions were immediate and pressing. Who were the victims? How had they ended up in her trunk? And perhaps most importantly, why? As the first lights of police cars flashed across the highway, the investigation that would unravel a web of shocking secrets had just begun. What started as a simple traffic stop was about to expose a darkness that no one in the quiet suburban town could have imagined. The moment backup arrived, the quiet highway transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Red and blue lights danced across the asphalt, illuminating the sedan and the grim discovery within its trunk. Detectives quickly took over, carefully documenting every detail, photographing the scene, and securing the bodies. The victims were two young adults, their identities still unknown, but their connection to the woman in the driver's seat seemed undeniable. Sarah Whitman sat nearby, composed yet strangely distant, her face betraying no emotion as officers began their work. Forensic specialists moved with precision, examining the blanket-covered bodies and the surrounding area for any trace of evidence. The smell that had triggered Officer Reynolds' unease was confirmed to be the faint odor of decomposition, suggesting the victims had been confined in the trunk for several hours, possibly longer. Investigators noted the meticulous way the bodies had been concealed, indicating a disturbing level of premeditation. There was no hasty concealment or chaotic effort. Everything had been calculated to remain hidden. As the night wore on, the first pieces of identification emerged. The victims were reported missing only days before, and both came from middle-class families in nearby towns. Their disappearances had caused concern, but had not yet captured national attention. Now, with the revelation of their deaths, the case escalated into a high-profile investigation. Authorities began retracing the victims' last known movements, combing through phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. Every detail, no matter how small, became a potential clue. What baffled investigators most was Sarah herself. She had no prior criminal record, no known history of violence, and no apparent motive. Friends described her as polite, intelligent, and seemingly unremarkable. Yet the evidence told a different story. Surveillance footage placed her car near both victims' homes on the nights they disappeared. Her digital footprint showed patterns of research and communication that suggested careful planning. It became increasingly clear that her outward appearance of normalcy was a mask, hiding something far more sinister. Detectives dug deeper into her background, uncovering subtle signs of a double life. Sarah had recently ended a relationship, and friends mentioned she had become increasingly withdrawn in the months prior. Investigators began connecting small anomalies, purchases of zip ties, trips to isolated areas late at night, and unaccounted-for absences that coincided with the victims' disappearances. Every lead strengthened the notion that these murders were deliberate acts, not random occurrences. As dawn approached, the magnitude of the case became undeniable. What began as a routine traffic stop had unveiled a carefully orchestrated crime, leaving the community in shock. Authorities realized that unraveling Sarah Whitman's motives and uncovering the full extent of her actions would take weeks, if not months. Families waited anxiously for answers, the city gripped by a sense of disbelief that someone so ordinary could commit such horrific acts. Every new piece of evidence added to the chilling portrait forming in the minds of investigators. A woman who could hide monstrous intentions behind an ordinary face, a woman whose calm exterior masked a darkness that would haunt the town for years to come. The investigation into Sarah Whitman's actions quickly became a complex puzzle, with each new piece revealing a more disturbing picture. Detectives pored over her background, searching for patterns that could explain why she had taken 2 lives and what her ultimate goal might have been. Her employment history offered little clue at first glance. She had worked as a personal assistant for several affluent families over the past few years, a role that required discretion, organization, and trust. Yet it was in these positions that investigators began to find a troubling connection to her victims. Both victims had ties to wealthy households. One had worked as a tutor for a family Sarah had assisted, while the other had been a close friend of a former employer. At first, the connections seemed tenuous, almost coincidental. But as detectives reviewed emails, messages, and financial records, a pattern emerged. Sarah had access to intimate details of these families' lives, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. Investigators realized that her victims were not chosen at random. They were selected with careful deliberation, people she believed held some form of subtle power or influence over her life. Digital forensics became a crucial tool in understanding the depth of her planning. Her phone contained encrypted messages, calendars marked with cryptic notes, and searches that revealed an obsession with disappearance cases and methods of evading detection. Her computer held documents detailing maps, transportation routes, and strategies for avoiding surveillance. It became clear that Sarah's actions were premeditated, executed with meticulous care to minimize the risk of discovery. Each victim represented a calculated decision, a puzzle piece in a larger, hidden design. Forensic teams also uncovered evidence in her personal spaces. A rented storage unit contained personal belongings of the victims, clothing, jewelry, and even notebooks, items she had taken before disposing of the bodies. The discovery indicated not only planning, but a disturbing desire to control every aspect of her victims' lives, even after their deaths. Investigators began to suspect that there could be more victims, given the methodical approach she had displayed. Interviews with friends, neighbors, and acquaintances painted a portrait of a woman leading a double life. Publicly, she maintained the appearance of normalcy, friendly interactions at local stores, casual conversations with neighbors, and social media posts portraying a carefree lifestyle. Privately, however, there were hints of a calculating mind, someone who meticulously observed and recorded details about those around her. These small inconsistencies, the sudden trips, unexplained absences, and secretive behaviors, began to take on new significance. As the investigation deepened, detectives realized the case was bigger than they had imagined. Sarah Whitman was not simply a murderer acting on impulse. She was a strategist, exploiting her access to private information to manipulate and eliminate her targets. The shocking realization left the team both fascinated and horrified. Every new lead added layers to the story, revealing a mind capable of orchestrating evil with chilling precision. The quiet suburban town, once considered safe and predictable, now faced the unsettling truth that darkness could hide behind the most ordinary faces, and that a single traffic stop had uncovered a web of secrets with far-reaching consequences. The investigation into Sarah Whitman's actions had already stunned the community, but as detectives delved deeper, the case began to reveal unexpected and shocking twists. One evening, while reviewing records from local rental properties, a detective noticed a receipt for a small boat rental near a remote lake on the outskirts of town. It was dated several weeks before the traffic stop. Curiosity piqued. Investigators decided to search the area, wondering if it might hold further clues. What they discovered changed everything. Buried near the shoreline, partially concealed by reeds and fallen leaves, was the body of a third victim. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team. This third murder suggested that Sarah's crimes were not limited to two impulsive acts. She had been operating over a much longer period, carefully covering her tracks and selecting victims with intent. The realization that the bodies in her trunk were only part of a broader pattern added a chilling layer to an already horrific case. Forensic analysis confirmed that this third victim had been killed in a similar manner to the first two. Small details, however, revealed new levels of premeditation. Evidence suggested she had lured the victim to the lake under the guise of a casual outing, using her knowledge of the victim's routines to create an opportunity without suspicion. Investigators realized that Sarah's intelligence and meticulous planning made her not only dangerous, but also elusive. She had orchestrated her crimes in a way that minimized attention, leaving no obvious trail until the traffic stop exposed her. The discovery also sparked renewed scrutiny of her relationships. Neighbors and friends were interviewed again, this time with a sharper focus on patterns and inconsistencies. Many recalled subtle oddities, Sarah disappearing for hours without explanation, vague excuses for absences, and an unusual interest in conversations about missing persons. Each anecdote, once dismissed as harmless, now contributed to a growing narrative of manipulation and deception. The detectives began to piece together a timeline that painted her as someone leading a dual life. One outwardly normal, one secretly sinister. What made the case even more unsettling was Sarah's apparent composure throughout the investigation. While most suspects displayed fear, anxiety, or remorse, she remained calculated, answering questions with careful neutrality, avoiding emotional display. Psychologists called in to evaluate her described traits associated with cold detachment and meticulous control, suggesting she may have been fully aware of the consequences of her actions while feeling no moral restraint. The community reacted with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could someone so ordinary, someone who walked among them without drawing suspicion, commit such calculated atrocities? Parents became more vigilant, schools heightened security, and social conversations shifted toward the unsettling realization that appearances could be deceiving. Meanwhile, detectives worked tirelessly to map out every movement, every contact, and every decision Sarah had made, understanding that the traffic stop had likely prevented additional tragedies. By the time the investigation reached this point, it was clear that Sarah Whitman's crimes were more than isolated acts of violence. They were the result of meticulous planning, careful observation, and a disturbing psychological pattern. The shocking twists, from the discovery of additional bodies to the insights into her double life, revealed a case that would haunt both law enforcement and the community for years. Each revelation brought new questions. How many more victims could there have been? And what had motivated a seemingly ordinary woman to commit such calculated horrors? The trial of Sarah Whitman drew national attention, turning the quiet suburban town into the center of a media storm. Courtrooms were filled with reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers, all eager to understand how a seemingly ordinary woman could commit such horrifying acts. The prosecution presented a meticulously organized case, detailing Sarah's planning, execution, and attempts to cover her tracks. Evidence from her digital devices, surveillance footage, and the discovery of personal items belonging to the victims painted a chilling picture of premeditation and cold calculation. Throughout the proceedings, Sarah maintained a composed exterior, showing little emotion as the prosecution laid out the timeline of her crimes. Each piece of evidence was scrutinized: the trunk of her car, the storage unit containing stolen belongings, the rental boat linked to the third victim, and her detailed online research into disappearance cases. Witness testimony revealed the duality of her life, with neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances describing a polite, ordinary woman who, behind closed doors, orchestrated a series of calculated murders. The stark contrast between her public persona and private actions left jurors and the public alike unsettled. The defense attempted to argue that Sarah had been under extreme emotional distress and that her actions were impulsive rather than premeditated. However, the overwhelming digital and physical evidence undermined these claims. Experts testified about her meticulous planning, the consistency of her methods, and the deliberate steps she had taken to evade detection. Even small details, such as carefully selecting victims connected to affluent families and controlling the scene after each murder, demonstrated a level of forethought incompatible with a purely impulsive act. As the trial progressed, the impact on the victims' families became heartbreakingly clear. Parents, siblings, and friends testified about the sudden, inexplicable loss of their loved ones, describing the emptiness and fear that lingered long after the initial shock. The public, riveted by the unfolding story, began to understand the deep consequences of her actions, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the broader sense of trust violated. A single ordinary-looking individual had upended the lives of multiple families, leaving a scar on the community that could not easily be healed. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Sarah Whitman was convicted on multiple counts of murder, her carefully maintained composure giving way to the inevitable weight of justice. Sentencing emphasized the severity and premeditated nature of her crimes, ensuring that she would face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For law enforcement, the case became a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance, even during seemingly routine procedures like a traffic stop. In the aftermath, the town struggled to reconcile the horror with the ordinariness of everyday life. Streets, schools, and neighborhoods once considered safe now carried a lingering unease. Yet amid the grief and shock, there was also a recognition of the diligence and perseverance of the officers who had uncovered the truth. The case of Sarah Whitman became a cautionary tale, illustrating that darkness can hide behind the most familiar faces, and that even the most routine encounters can reveal the unimaginable. For the families of the victims, closure came slowly, but the conviction provided a measure of justice, and the reassurance that the woman responsible for their suffering would never harm another soul.